Great.
Welcome,
Wonderful.
everybody.
Can
My
I,
name is Nina Jane, and I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library. Really thrilled to be here with Rachael Cobb. This is our third program with us about voting rights. She's unbelievable. Before I get to her, though, I just want to say thanks to the Ashland Public Library, the Friends of the Ashland Public Library, who support all of our programming, as well as these libraries who have partnered with us on this because Rachael so graciously let us partner. So we welcome patrons from Tewksbury, Lowell, Wakefield, Needham, Morse Library, Natick, Marlborough, Wellesley, Maynard, Danvers, Beverly, Northampton, and Rockport. As most people who know me know that I'm going to say that when libraries work together, we can kind of make magic. And I feel like all of these programs that we've brought to you through collaboration have been magical. So today we're talking about gerrymandering and dark money in democracy. And Rachael is a professor at Suffolk University. She talks about this extensively. And as I said, this is her third program with us. So I just know that she's like the best person to talk to us about this. So we will be taking questions after Rachael's presentation. So put your questions in the Q&A and I will be moderating them as they come through. So welcome, Rachael. Thank you once again for being with us.
Thank you, Mina, and it is a pleasure to be here, and hello to everyone. In looking at my PowerPoint, I will not be able to see the chat, so I do encourage Mina, especially if there's something that I'm not getting because it's in the chat, please feel free to just jump in and say whatever needs to be said. And my plan is to teach a little bit about what gerrymandering is, what dark money is, and why they are connected, and then have a discussion and answer questions and think about the future. So the main thing I think we need to start with are the launch questions, which is we're going to begin with the most fundamental question, I think, to this broader issue of democracy. What is a district? And then what is redistricting? Why do districts change? And then what is gerrymandering? And another way of saying that is, how can districts be manipulated in a negative kind of way? What is dark money? And how do we fund elections? And then we'll talk about the relationship between dark money and gerrymandering. Although they're not necessarily connected in any particular way, I think the fundamental uniting characteristic of both of these at this point in time in 2023 is the issue of how both of these forces are eroding democracy at the moment. Okay, so let's start with what is a district. And at its most basic level, a district is a political or electoral district, constituency or voting district, a geographical area typically used for the purpose of electing representatives to a legislative body, such as a parliament, a Congress, or a local council. It could be a water board, it could be any number of things. And boundaries are typically defined based on the size of the population, the number of people living in that place, ensuring the one idea is that we want to ensure that districts have roughly equal number of residents to maintain fairness and equal representation, so that for every X number of voters, there's one representative. When I talk about this in my classes, I tend to analogize this to class size. So if you have one teacher for every 20 kindergarten students, then you have roughly equal representation. However, as we all know, different classes of kindergarten students might have different needs. So one teacher serving 20 students who present one set of needs may be very different than one teacher representing 20 students who have very, very high needs. And so not every student is going to be as well served. But the basic concept with equal representation of district size is population size. However, we have other kinds of districts that we draw or have. And one example is the United States Senate, which is not based on population size. As we know, the population of California is 39.24 million. Rhode Island has 1.96 million. Wyoming has 578, sorry, not million. That was an error this morning. I apologize. But every state still gets 2 senators. So the math is dramatically different, the kind of representation that California gets versus the kind of representation that Wyoming gets. Not 578 million, 578,000 people, period. Okay, so why and when do we redistrict? What is redistricting? It is the process of defining and redrawing political district boundaries. And the idea here is that people move, they change, there's migration. And this is typically carried out periodically every 10 years with the census. This happens at all levels of government, or theoretically it's supposed to happen. So it happens at the state level with state legislative districts. It happens in cities with the districts for precincts and wards. And we redistrict to reflect the changes in the population and the distribution of the population. So without redistricting, we would have what we would say unequal voting power. If District A has 32 voters and 1 representative versus District B that has 2 voters and 1 representative, District B has much more voting power than District A. So before the apportionment revolution of the 1960s, most legislative districts in the United States were mal-apportioned. So mal meaning bad and apportion meaning apportion, to apportion a cake and to give people equal slices of cake. If you mal-apportion, one person gets half the cake and everybody else gets, 1/32 of that cake. So back before the the apportionment revolution, legislatures crafted their districts with unequal populations, and they constructed maps benefiting both the majority of sitting legislators and the majority party. They changed constitutional rules fairly regularly to suit their objectives. And especially rural legislators in the United States altered the constitutional apportionment criteria, and they essentially ignored their constitutional responsibilities and left in place old lines, meaning that they retained power in their districts. And as people moved out of them, they still had the same power. And so there were some districts that had a lot of people and 1 representative, and just like the previous picture, districts that had very few people and 1 representative. So they increased their voting power in that way. So along came the 1960s and the apportionment cases before the Supreme Court. The first one being Reynolds v. Sims, which happened in 1962. And issues regarding reapportionment and redistricting, the court found to be justiciable. Before that, they said, we don't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole. And so basically they said, yes, courts can intervene on this. And voters have the right to sue under the 14th Amendment. The new interpretation of the 14th Amendment was that the equal protection before the law required equal representation, and this concept of 1 person, 1 vote came to be the standard. Then in 1963, Gray v. Sanders, a Georgia county unit system of deciding primaries where the primary winner was determined by who won the unit, not the total number of votes, sort of like who won the state, sort of like the Electoral College. And the court used the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause to argue that the system was unconstitutional, and affirmed essentially the principle that had been set forth previously, that all citizens should carry equal weight regardless, their vote should carry equal weight regardless of their geographic location. So who draws the districts? In most cases, it is politician dominated, and it takes different forms in different states. Some states form political commissions. Other states have a state legislature draw and approve maps as a body. And other states have an independent redistricting commission, and some have a hybrid, use a mix of the 2 to draw their lines. The concept of having politicians dominated is not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's kind of fallen into disfavor recently, with a lot of reformers really seeking the independent redistricting process, which has its benefits. But One thing to just recall is that, of course, elected representatives managing the boundaries also makes a lot of sense rather than having non-elected people. So who has appointment power over independent redistricting commissions? If that is done by a politician, that in and of itself, it means that those people are not elected by the people. So there are there's no system that is pure, no system that is perfect, but not a bad thing for us to consider ways to design systems that are going to create the most fairness and equal access to the vote that we can imagine. So here's a map of the United States as of 2021 and the kinds of variation that we have across the states and who's drawing it. So you can see in the light blue, sorry, the light green, it is the legislature, and the light yellow, with the exceptions of Virginia, is a slightly darker yellow, as is New Jersey. But the light yellow has an independent commission, and then the very light green has a backup commission. Okay, so if this is who's in charge of drawing the lines, and this is how we draw the lines, a little bit about how we draw the lines. What is the process of manipulating those lines? So that is the question about what is gerrymandering. So gerrymandering is the manipulation of electoral district boundaries for political advantage. And the term gerrymandering was coined back in the early 19th century after Massachusetts Governor Eldridge Gerry signed a redistricting plan that favored his political party. And the goal of a gerrymander is for one political party or group to gain an unfair advantage in elections by strategically configuring the boundaries of the electoral districts. And there are two key ways of doing this. So here's the famous gerrymander. And here's another one from Illinois' 4th Congressional District. Just a nice picture. So I'm going to actually jump that side. So how do you gain political advantage through the gerrymander? Well, one way is to pack a district, to put all of the opposing party supporters into a few districts and limit their overall representation. So you put everybody who you don't agree with in one tight space, and then everybody else is dispersed, and you win all of those bigger areas. And therefore the less impact in other districts where the favored party has a stronger presence. The other way you can do it is crack. You can literally, go through and chop up all of these districts and dilute the opposing party supporters across multiple districts to diminish their influence. And by spreading the opposition voters thinly across all of these multiple districts, their voting power is weakened and it becomes difficult for them to secure victories in any particular district. All right, so I think it's fairly obvious, but let's walk through, why would we gerrymander? Why would we engage in that kind of thing? We want to manipulate electoral outcomes to our favor. We want to win elections, and we want that to be safe for us. We want to know that we're going to win, not just that we're going to try to win. We want to know that we're going to win. So it's sort of in the bag. And the next sort of thing that we might want to do is ensure that we're going to win more seats than our overall popular vote would suggest. So that if we have X percentage of Democrats or Republicans in a particular state, we don't want it to be proportional to the exact expression of that, the existing proportion. We want it to be even bigger. So we want our margin to be bigger. But this has significant implications for the democratic process because it can fundamentally undermine fair representation. So if we have a particular percentage of Republicans and Democrats in a state, we would like to see that reflected in the state legislature. If we don't, if we see one party that they're 30% of Republicans in a state, but they only have 10% of the votes, then that is unfair representation. They are not getting the representation that their population suggests. That can distort the will of the electorate as a result of that. And many argue that it undermines the principles of democratic governance because it allows politicians to choose their voters rather than having voters choose their representatives. Efforts to combat gerrymandering include independent redistricting commissions, transparent and impartial processes for redrawing district boundaries, and legal challenges to unfair district maps. All right, so now we've kind of covered what's a district, who draws them, how we think of them, their sizes, and those kinds of things. Now we're going to shift gears entirely and look at dark money and what dark money is and sort of what money is. Let's start with that. The term dark money arises from, I guess it's light money if it's transparent, and it's dark money if it's if we don't know where it's coming from. So the accountability surrounding the funds is lacking, and therefore it is dark. And so it's political spending or contributions where the true source of the money is undisclosed or obscured. And what we see happening in American politics is that the use of funds from undisclosed donors or organizations is being used to influence political campaigns, elections, and policy debates. And it can come from various sources, from corporations, it can come from individuals, or it can come from special interest groups. So how does money become dark money? And that is typically campaign finance laws requiring disclosure of donors and contributions to ensure transparency in the political process that sort of was the standard. Dark money operates through these other mechanisms and loopholes that allow contributors to remain anonymous or hide their financial involvement. And as noted, it can be used to finance these political activities, as I've already pointed out, but it also can include political advertisements, support for opposing candidates, financing issue advocacy campaigns, or promoting specific policy agendas. Now, what impact can dark money have? It can impact elections, public opinion, without voters knowing the true interests or the motivations behind the funding, or not even really connecting the dots that ads that they're seeing are being funded in a particular way by particular interests behind it. So there are arguments, though, in favor and against dark money. Let's start with the arguments in favor of it. Proponents of it say that banning anonymous political spending infringes on fundamental rights, including the First Amendment right to freedom of speech and the freedom of association. Proponents also argue that putting disclosure requirements on it puts donors at risk, and that the requiring donors to all outside political groups to disclose their identities puts them at risk of harassment by opponents. Critics argue that it undermines the integrity of the democratic process, that we should know where the money is coming from, and we should know who's funding the different messages that we're hearing. Critics also say that wealthy individuals, corporations, or interest groups are essentially able to exert undue influence over elections and policy decisions without public scrutiny. And furthermore, that most of us cannot fund all of the issues that we're passionate about. So it's a very small and concentrated group of voices that are participating in it. Critics also furthermore argue that campaign finance transparency is crucial to maintain fair and accountable political system, enabling voters to make informed decisions and preventing the potential for corruption. Okay, so where did dark money come from? How did this come to be? Why are we talking about it more than we used to maybe 13, 15, 20 years ago? Well, number one, it has been, dark money has been around a long time. There's plenty of times in which money we don't know the true source of it, but it has increased following the US Supreme Court's 2010 decision in Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, which was a landmark case that opened the floodgates to political spending by corporations in federal elections, including dark money groups, and set up to shield the identity of their wealthy funders. According to Open Secrets, which is an organization following money and spending in US politics, dark money groups funded by individuals, companies, labor unions, and even potentially foreign governments, spent more than $1 billion on federal elections. And in the run-up to the 2022 midterm elections, super PACs, hybrid PACs, two types of political action committees that can accept political donations, reported receiving $400 million from dark money groups. And not included in this 400 million figure is the tens of millions of dollars that dark money organizations spent on ads purchased directly from broadcasters and social media companies. Okay, so now we move to what is the connection between dark money and gerrymandering. And the thing I want to, I think, begin with, that I don't have a exact drop down menu for, but want to say, is that when the technology that we are using today to draw maps is incredibly sophisticated, and that the access to being able to have a very precise way of going down a street and putting different houses into districts, et cetera, is incredibly precise. But that takes a particular expertise, and it takes technological savvy. And so there are a lot of organizations now that are getting into the business of helping parties draw maps, helping individuals draw maps. And those people can now command great amounts of money to be able to draw maps. And so there's this connection now between drawing the maps, who is supporting the maps, and who benefits from the maps. And so what we want to do is kind of trace the money that's going through there. So dark money can be used to support advocacy organizations that promote or oppose specific redistricting plans or policies. And organizations can engage in public relations campaign, lobbying efforts, or legal challenges related to gerrymandering, i.e., they can support not only the drawing of the maps, but also get citizens to rise up and say, like, we oppose the radical liberal or the radical conservative maps that are being proposed in the state legislature. And so lots of pressure can be applied to any of the different organizations involved in actually drawing the maps, et cetera. So the money is going to the advocacy efforts, and the money is going to the drawers of the maps, and the money is going, you can see that there's a lot of money. So by funneling all of these undisclosed funds to these groups, individuals or entities with a vested interests, those folks can then exert an influence over the redistricting process, pushing for outcomes that align with their goals. So the combination of the gerrymandering and the dark money results in a system where politicians and interest groups with financial resources gain disproportionate political power and influence over elections and policy outcomes. Because if you now control the state legislature, you control the policy in a state. And it undermines the fundamental principle of fair representation and leads to this overall disconnect between the will of the people and the actions of elected representatives. The interplay between dark money and gerrymandering is, on the one hand, comprehensive campaign finance reforms is one way that this could be addressed. Another way to address it is transparency measures and push for those in various states. Efforts to ensure an impartial redistricting process. And by promoting all of these kinds of things, that the idea on the part of reformers is that the potential for hidden influences and undemocratic outcomes can be mitigated. I went online to find a couple of, I thought, graphics that nicely pointed some things out. So I'm just going to show some graphics before I wrap up. Number one is, so here's how dark money influences politics. And we start at the top with a corporation or rich person has political interests. They donate that money to a super PAC or a political nonprofit. That money buys flyers, robocalls, issue-based ads. That then those ads help a candidate win an election. The politician votes in support of the corporation's interests, and the circle continues. I'm going to jump ahead to this slide. This is a particular example, and I have to say, gerrymandering is nonpartisan in the sense that, i.e., both parties engage in it a lot, and the courts try to stop some of those parties from doing it, et cetera. So here's an example of Republicans, but this is applicable to Democrats as well. So how hundreds of thousands of dollars flowed through the GOP's campaign finance network in a 3-day period. So Sheldon Adelson, billionaire, makes a $2.5 million donation to the RSLC. The RSLC, based in Washington, makes a $200,000 donation to its Georgia Political Action Committee a day later. And then that same day, that state Political Action Committee makes a donation to the House GOP Trust. And then the trust, run by Representative Matt Hatchett, gives $750,000 to the Georgia GOP. So this is a way of sort of, in this sense, this is not dark money, right? We're following the money, but this is how money can get funneled. Now, just going back to this state, this is an example of state-by-state redistricting reform and the local roots. So this map shows where there are independent commissions, where there are other advisory commissions, and divided government and systems that have public input. So I'm going to end there, and now I'm hoping to take questions from the audience. Yes, right at about 10:30.
Thank you, Rachel. We do have lots of questions, and I'm going to ask people to start putting their questions in the Q&A and some people already have, just so that it's easier for me to keep track of. But there was a little bit of confusion about how districts are drawn. Some people thought it was by population size, not voter size, and there's another one about is it determined by number of residents, not citizens?
Okay, it is determined by the number of people. Doesn't matter who those people are, the number of people. That's how we do the census. And that's how we just determine a district. And then what was the one right or before that you mentioned?
It was a similar question. Are they drawn by population size, not voter size? But you're saying resident, the number of people in the actual people.
It's people. It's
Okay.
people. It's people. So you can have a lot of mountains, a lot of space. You can also have a lot of undocumented people, but those people are counted. We want to count people because people use resources.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And do prisoners count in the population?
Yes, but that is an area that I always have to go back to remind myself because it's tricky and complicated. So yes, they count, but one of the questions, and perhaps somebody in the audience knows this better than I do. One of the questions is, are they counted as being, is it the prison that counts and the population in that prison, or is it their home residence? And I don't know if there's a national standard for that.
I'm not sure either, because I think we talked about this in our last meeting, and we were talking about how in Florida, they said, yes, prisoners could vote, but then they made so many barriers to it that it was almost impossible for prisoners to vote.
Right. So but that's also, there's felon disenfranchisement. So whether felons, whether in prison or after they serve their term, can vote, that's one question. And where they vote, that's also another question. But then the question is how are they counted for the purpose of the census? And that's the one where
Okay.
Need to look it up.
A couple people mentioned Moon Duchin.
Yeah, Duchin. Mm-hmm. Her mathematical analysis of gerrymandering. Will it change anything? I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of really great people doing a lot of great math on this right now. One of the tricky, there are a lot of tricky things about it, but I guess one thing is, I'll just say this sort of rather bluntly, how much math do lawyers understand? some lawyers understand a lot of math and some, not as much, just like the general population. But that means that who's making the decisions based on the math? Do they have a fundamental understanding of what the math is? Maybe they do and are going to make decisions that we agree or don't agree with. Or maybe they don't and are making decisions where they are a little confused on the concept. And we're seeing the same thing with social media issues in Congress, just the understanding, the fundamental understanding of technology is something that, requires a lot of study and care. And these people are incredibly busy doing a lot of other things. So their, just ability to get that information into their heads it's tough. I'm sympathetic.
An interesting explanation of the math, I believe, in the chat, which people can look at. But Judith says that, and I had this question as well, is mentioning the new role of the courts in allowing the legislatures to manipulate gerrymandering. Is that new, or is it just that it's more geared towards a certain side right now?
I think there are a couple of things to take into consideration. First of all, the courts did not get in on the action until the 1960s, when the Supreme Court said, yes, go ahead, you can get involved. And there's a really great, I'm trying to remember what radio show it was, but a radio program about that question before the court, Reynolds v. Sims, being absolutely striking panic within members of the Supreme Court over whether to take this up or not, because they understood that it was, the reason that they didn't want to take it up was because it's so political. And did the court want to get in on political questions? Right? Surprise for us today, but back then it was a major source of anxiety. They ultimately decided they did because actually every single legislative district in the United States at the time was malapportioned. Like, it was really bad. And so how is that equal? How is that serving democracy? So they essentially, it's rather dramatic. They equalize everything. And within a 10-year period, districts are now equal. And one of the things that political scientists found is that if you track the money that flows with votes, the money started to flow to the population centers that had been underrepresented prior to then. Okay, so now the courts are in on the action, and now our polarized politics today, it's just that everything is now litigated, everything. So it's going to the courts because we are at these razor thin margins in all of these places, and everything is political, and it's hyper partisan and hyper toxic and hyper awful. So we're sending it to the courts because we sort of have no other referee to, and every group is suing every other group because that's their only form of redress, because they feel that the political system is completely out to undermine everything that they stand for.
Can you explain what was the reasoning for the striking down of Citizens United?
Why Citizens United essentially passed, or what I mean, so let's just remember, I am a political scientist, not a lawyer. So so I will say, I will not, I don't know if I'm going to capture the legal reasoning in as elegant a way as my legal friends could. But the idea was, look, from the perspective of Justice Roberts, who had the majority opinion, wrote the majority opinion in the case, was that he felt that, I mean, he basically said, like, corporations are people, and if we are preventing corporations from being able to give unlimited amounts of contributions, then we are fundamentally preventing free speech. So the idea of Citizens United is we have to, free marketplace of ideas, unleash everything, liberalize it all, so that anybody who needs to be able to participate in the political system, we are not restricting. The view on the, again, I don't know, the view of letting corporations in on it was to unleash what we're seeing as anti-free speech regulations preventing discussion. I can also say what the dissent said, but we'll
That's okay. What if you ask for momentum at the federal level for a standard way to draw a district line? And do they even have the power to do that?
No. I would say there is momentum nationally among reform groups. I mean, there is momentum to try to change campaign finance laws, to try to change how districting is done, to try to change all of these things. But at the moment, all of the action for drawing lines is at the state level. It's not at the national level. And I think, this is one of those cases of like, be careful what you wish for, because I'm not sure we want the federal government to be in on drawing the local lines of Massachusetts and having control there, or Texas or California or North Dakota. So having people on the ground and the thinking behind who draws the lines in the first place way back in the 1780s was that it was the state legislatures that were closest to it, and they were elected representatives. Now, they were elected by a very small group of people because most people were disenfranchised at the time, and it was kind of the elites running the show on every single level. And so it all seemed kind of okay. But it was wildly unequal until the 1960s.
Yeah. Stephen asks if from your perspective, if there's any realistic solutions to gerrymandering. It feels so overwhelming. If a proposed map is clearly gerrymandered, why is there not some process to prevent this BS? He apologizes, but that's what it is.
Well, I guess there is a process. We do have a process. We have you can litigate, you can send it to the courts, you can have, states have processes. I think the frustrating thing for all of us is that these are long processes. Who's in charge of these processes? It's sort of coming down to, it's not so much the processes, I think, that are as problematic for partisans on either side. It is who is running these processes and how these processes are being determined. So, I count myself as among people who would like to reform the political system for the better to make everything work. But the thing that I'm always bumping my head up against is that it's people who run these processes, and those people, it's very hard to design a perfect system. And I actually think gerrymandering, I think district drawing in and of itself, they're always going to be winners and losers. You can never draw a district that is a quote unquote perfect district, because it is perfect in the eyes of one and so imperfect in the eyes of another. And then you say, okay, well, we're going to have these principles that are going to guide us, that we want to make sure that we have full minority representation, or we actually want to help minorities in this case, or we want to help any particular group of people to gain political power who have been underrepresented in so many ways prior. But as you do that, other people feel that they are losing power. And even when, the case of, we've seen there's a whole lot of debate within the literature over sometimes when you give minorities like a district such that they can get a minority representative from that district. So you're essentially packing them so they get the minority representative, but then you're diluting their vote in every place else, and they're losing actual political power every place else. So how do you balance those things? So it's really hard to do this well. But it's obvious, I think, to all of us when it's horrible.
Yeah. Judith is push back a little bit on the court thing. She said that in North Carolina, the Supreme Court is taking the court appeals out of the equation, and so that the legislature steps can't be challenged.
Right. There's now, you're absolutely right. There are now efforts to, so I said, right, we have processes, and now the electoral process is working its way in certain states to remove key guardrail people, gatekeepers, such that there's sort of unfettered political power, and those are highly problematic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in response to that, Lisa says, how can voters push back using dark money and gerrymandering, and in any way this legislative push to not allow people to challenge what they want?
Well, what people can do is, first of all, support their nonpartisan groups that are working on these reform measures and get involved in them. You know, at the end of the day, I'm not saying it is always a perfect tool. It isn't, but the tool that we have as regular old people is sunlight and exposing these things. So what we have at our disposal is to support these groups that are taking this action. The other thing I would say, and I know this is kind of out of left field, but this is a whole other conversation, a whole other time, but local newspapers and the media, and having organizations that are dedicated to doing the really difficult and scary, actually, investigative reporting to follow the money. And so the strength of our media and our independent media is directly related to this. And then the other thing is, it's all, I think every answer I have is like these long-term solutions that are not quick fixes. But the other piece of it is that civics education for our young people and understanding not only how our government is supposed to work, how it does work, but also what concentrated power really means. If they have a fundamental understanding of that, and how politicians on any side of the ledger work hard to concentrate their power. And so we have to have those things in place to prevent that concentration in place. But you have to have an understanding of that fundamentally, and that comes from education, comes from the press, and it comes from the groups that are doing the advocacy, because no other groups in the political system are doing that kind of advocacy other than those real nonpartisan, reformist oriented groups. But sometimes it's tough because they have some pie in the sky ideas and you're like, that'll never work. But
we can only do what we can, right? But
yeah.
it feels a little bit helpless. And somebody says that in Ohio, despite a constitutional amendment for fair districts, and the Ohio Supreme Court rejected the Republican-controlled maps 7 times, and the Republicans ran out the clock, and the unconstitutional maps were used in 2022. So what can we do in those kind of situations?
This is one of those, I don't know the answer. So I'm not familiar with the Ohio, is Ohio elected, or is the Ohio Supreme Court elected or non-elected? I don't know. Chime in. I would say with these kinds of situations, again, my solutions are not anything that anybody can do overnight, but I have real concerns over elected judges, because that in and of itself is, money is flowing to those elections and flowing to those judges to vote in particular favor. And I think, once upon a time, it used to be pretty non-partisan in some kind of way. It's gotten, the money in judicial elections has gotten a lot more. So that's a concern. Mm-hmm. Ohio Supreme Court and all courts are elected. Well, the Supreme Court in Massachusetts is not elected. They're appointed by the governor.
Oh, interesting. So Huck asked, and I'm not sure if you would know the answer to this, is can you tell us about the Koch brothers and their behind the scenes influences in the US? And it feels like their names come up a lot, but there are other players like them that are influencing all manner of our politics.
So I mean, I'm certainly aware of the influence that the Koch brothers, among other major donors, have, and I I don't I mean I can't say all of the different moving pieces of about exactly what has caused what. The bigger picture about concentrated wealth and the access that wealth has in our political system, I think, is the more important story. And the United States, I mean, income inequality has gone up and up and up, not the other way around. And that means that more and more money is more and more concentrated in the hands of a very few. And those very few have, like the Koch brothers, used their money to form political influence and to control various things. So the key here is unlocking that concentration and putting roadblocks up so that they don't have as much political power. It is not a transparent or fair system.
Stephen asked, what is the currently enforced standards for allowable variation in population size between districts represented in the U.S. House of Representatives?
I can't remember the exact number. It's under 10% though.
Okay, he thinks it
So
might be
plus or minus. He thinks it might be what? I mean, I could Google it. But it's very small.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to leave Lindsay's question for last because it's a good one. But I think you've sort of answered it, but I want to keep it for last. What is there going to be? Do you think there's going to be anything that we can do in the next, if going forward to the 2024 election to manage any of this?
I'm trying to just find the right words to say. The thing about elections that is actually always an opportunity is that they are moments of education. It's a common thing that we're all going through to watch and participate in this democratic process. It's a long haul. We all know it. We're all exhausted from it. There are all of these things, but they are moments of education and high alertness, and the issues take on a heightened salience. So these are the times that we can use to connect with our fellow citizens, with our schools, with our groups, and do education about all of this. And people are willing to talk about it in a way that they're not always willing to talk about it at other times. So, we can't, as I've said repeatedly, sadly, there's, stuff we can't change overnight. But we can. I mean, the only thing we've got is each other and the people of the United States to learn about these issues and engage in them. I think as we watch state governments and the power of state governments and them asserting their power in a lot of different ways over the last several months, especially, it has also inspired a lot of people who have said, I never in a million years thought I would run for office. They're suddenly deciding to run for office. Massachusetts has one of the lowest rates of competitiveness in legislative elections. And we, as I think many people know, we are pretty much a one-party state. What would help Massachusetts? Actually having a stronger Republican Party to be the counterbalance. So one of the things that makes elections useful, even though challenging, is that they're competitive. So competitive elections, I think, are a fairly good thing to have around. They force some of that sunlight. They force some of these discussions. So what we can do in anticipation of the 2024 election is gear up to educate each other and gear up to use this as an opportunity to mobilize our fellow citizens, to vote. And I would actually say mobilize our fellow citizens to run for office. Doesn't matter what level. You don't have to run for president or Senate or House. You can run for city council or school committee or water board or whatever. But that engagement in our government, the more people who are engaged and doing that, I think overall, the better off we are. But the more information that people have in a clear, concise way. Of course, I know we're all up against misinformation, and it's going to be even worse now. I mean, it's just getting worse. So how can we, I think that's another thing to just think about. How can we combat the misinformation and get the real information out there? And at the end of the day, just like we're sort of talking about in the college classroom of ChatGPT and how do you know whether a paper is a paper, blah, blah, blah. What are we going to do? Like I was talking with my colleagues yesterday, if all admissions essays are going to be written by ChatGPT, well, all of these colleges are now going to do interviews. Mm-hmm. So, okay, so maybe that's what we have to do. Actually go talk to people, not look at social media.
I love that. I was going to say that the last time you and I talked was right before the 2022 election. And neither of us are feeling very hopeful about the direction of politics. Are you feeling any differently from that time?
I wish I could channel that part of myself. I am, the only thing I have is hope. So I am hopeful that look, I will say one of the great things about the 2020 election was how much turnout we had. There was a huge amount of engagement, and there was actually in the 2022 elections too, and I think there's going to be even more. So in that sense, I'm extremely hopeful. I saw Stephen's point about town meeting, and I could not agree more. Town meeting model is highly problematic.
Mm-hmm. I can agree with that too. We actually had about a 70% voter rate at our last town meeting election. Wow. It was unbelievable. It's usually around 20 to 30%.
And what propelled it?
Nothing. There was nothing controversial or, I think people were just paying more attention and being more engaged. So that to me gave me some hope that people are paying more attention.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go to Lindsay's question because I think you answered it, because I do have one more and we'll see how time is going. So Lindsay's question is, what are the top 3 things that you recommend people do to influence their local community, town, city voting processes and access?
If you have a local newspaper, support your local newspaper. I think that, the top 3, right? I'm just going to sound like a doctor. It depends on who you are and what you're good at. But to influence your local community, town, and voting access, I think actually one of the things to do is get to know your local election commission, and don't go into it with an adversarial relationship, because I do think that our local election commissioners are doing their darndest to follow the law, and they are living within those strictures. But if you feel that they are violating the law in any kind of way, I would get in touch with the Secretary of State's office. But get to know them and what they're thinking about and where they're putting voting locations. They are, for the most part, good people trying to do well by the laws that they live under. And I say this as the daughter of a former election commissioner. Work as a poll worker on election day. Work with, volunteer your time or support others who are volunteering their time if you don't have the time. But I think just getting to know the structures and getting to know the people can help to unpack it, and then therefore help you to be part of the solution when it comes time to choose where a polling location will be, or whether the polling location, things to think about are, is it accessible? a GAO report several years ago found that a third of polling locations in the country are not accessible to people with disabilities. Are they using the equipment at the polling location that is serving people with disabilities? So I also think about the most vulnerable in the community, the people for whom the barriers are even higher, and what are things that local cities and towns can do to lower those barriers, and even barriers to information. Are there people whose multiple constituencies in that place that speak a second language, and are there ways to provide that information in second language? So those are the things I would think about, is just how do we invite people into the process and help them feel welcome, because that's also a barrier to participation.
Right, absolutely. Well, that is amazing. That was a really good answer to that question, I think, because we do need to feel hope, and that we can have some influence on this thing that has been in the news for like the last over 10 years now.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for doing this, Rachel, again. And we are, for everybody here, we are in conversation about doing something else later in the year on something that Rachel is really, really passionate about, is grassroots voter movement. So I'll send you information about that if we get that together. But in the meantime, thank you again. I feel like I learned so much from you every time we talk.
Thank you. Thank you. It is my pleasure. Love libraries, love librarians. That's another thing to do, is support your local library.
Absolutely. We are bastion information.
Yes. Yes.
So,
yes. So thank you for all of your efforts.
Thanks. We feel like libraries are also in that mix of.
I know. It's very concerning.
It is. And Massachusetts is a good place to work. So I'm really happy where I am. But thank you all for being here, and go out and do your civic duty. And we'll hear from Rachel again, hopefully later in the year.
Thank you. All right. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.